Hello, and welcome to another episode of What's Your Ripple, a podcast capturing true tales and stories of how beautiful people like you, me, and my guest are making incredible positive ripples in people's lives, changing their lives forever. And today, if you are active duty military, or an active duty military spouse, or you know of anybody that fits that category, this episode is especially for you because I have a wonderful guest who spent 25 years with her husband in the military, and she has learned quite a few things that she's sharing now with her new book. So it is with great pleasure for me to introduce to you today Beth Runkle. Welcome, Beth. And can you please tell me what's your ripple?
Sure. Well, thanks so much for having me on your show. I really appreciate it, especially since you're a veteran. And thank you for your service. And thank
Thank you.
you to everybody who is listening who served both in uniform and supporting those in uniform. I did not come from a military family. And when you become part of a family, you realize the freedoms we enjoy in our country, they are not free. People have sacrificed for them. So I'm incredibly grateful and appreciative of the sacrifices that those who serve in uniform make for our country, for the freedoms that we enjoy, and for this great nation of ours.
Absolutely.
So my ripple
Yes.
is really, it's a bit of a story. But first of all, I married my husband. We had dated long distance. We met at a wedding. So I was a bridesmaid. He was a groomsman. Yes, it does happen outside of romantic comedies. And he was already serving in the military at that time. And since we dated long distance, I never really was around the military culture and honestly had not felt it necessary to explain to me what it would be like to marry someone in the military. And I'm thankful for that now because I'm very happily married. And I don't think I would have married him if I would have known um, just the lack of control that you have over your life and the dramatic changes that would happen.
Mm.
So we actually moved three times our first year of marriage. And then we
Oh,
showed
wow.
up to that third station. We unpacked our boxes again, and he deployed to the Middle East.
Oh, no.
And so I found myself thinking, like, again, I've been married less than a year at this point, and I'm just like, wow, what have I gotten myself into? This is not at all what I thought marriage was going to be, right? I
Right.
had been very career oriented. I had been really close to my family, and all of that had been sacrificed for marriage. And then he's not even there. And
Mhm.
that was
So you in first year you moved three times. Now you're sitting at a base. What base were you at?
We were at Langley Air Force Base,
Okay, so and you were originally from where?
Florida.
So you're sitting in Langley Air Force Base by yourself now, and your husband is now in the Middle East.
Correct.
And you're like, wait a second, I don't have family, I don't have friends, I don't have my my neighborhood.
Hmm.
I'm in a strange place, and the man I married is now overseas.
Yes.
Mm,
So honestly, I was not a great wife in the beginning years. I found myself very quickly um, selfish,
mhm,
hating the military and everything about it, hating the inconveniences that it put on my life. I do have to say that assignment was especially rough because he deployed four times, and then
ooh,
there were hurricanes that came through too. And when a hurricane comes through, um, you don't realize that the person wearing the uniform evacuates with the very expensive equipment and weapons, and they leave you, if you're the
mhm,
spouse and the kids, to deal with the impact of the hurricane by yourself. So it was just a rough 2 to 3 years. So we found marriage getting really rough
oh yeah,
because I was bitter, resentful, and our communication was not good. And, just kind of wondering, is marriage worth it? Like, is this worth fighting for?
right,
So we would move again. And sorry about that. We would move again. And this time, we ran into some fellow airmen who invited
mhm,
us to get involved in their Bible study. And by this point in
Nice.
time, we'd also been dealing with infertility. I had been raised in the church, but I never read the Bible for myself and never really understood the significance of what Jesus did on the cross and really didn't see myself as a sinner. My standard was kind of like, I'm not an axe murderer. Like, I'm not killed anybody. So I'm a pretty good person. And we went to this Bible study because I think we were struggling in our marriage, but
Mhm.
also just life in general. Um, infertility, moving again, loneliness, all the things. And really, I was desperate for community. So in this Bible study, we dug into the scriptures. I started in the book of Genesis and actually in Sarah and Abraham's story, which is what my book is about. And for the first time, I understood, that God's standard was perfection, and that if I had sinned even once, then what I deserved was eternal separation from God. But that if I placed my faith in Jesus, that he took the penalty on my behalf, then I could have the promise of eternal life, but not just eternal life in the afterlife, abundant life in the here and now, doing life with God and trusting him.
Mhm.
So through a process, both my husband and I came to believe, and that began to put some good changes into our marriage. But it really wasn't until we went to a marriage conference um, at the end of that year where we learned about the what I like to call the biblical blueprint for marriage. And it's just really understanding what God's design for marriage is. And I think at this point in time, my education on marriage had pretty much come from the romantic comedies I grew up watching, which don't get me
Mhm.
wrong, I really like a good romantic comedy, but
Oh
it's
yeah.
not really the best marriage advice. A romantic comedy kind of tells you like you should be happy.
Mhm.
And that if you're not happy, then maybe you made a mistake. And I think my picture of marriage was a contract, when marriage really is a covenant. It's a promise till death do you part, and God is a part of that. And then we also understood roles in marriage. I understood how important respect was to my husband, and just kind of realized that all of my negativity about his job in the military, was really being seen by him as disrespect. I think that something that I did not understand was that when a man or a woman serves in uniform, it really is a calling. It's not just a job. A
Right.
calling really is something that someone feels called to do, not unlike what we consider our pastors or our clergy. A calling is defined as something that is someone's special duty or obligation to perform, that they feel that they must do. And when I began to understand that, I began to be able to appreciate the military more, but also see that if God had caused me to marry this man who I didn't understand anything about the military, then he had a calling on me too. And it didn't involve wearing the uniform or using the weapons or deploying,
Right.
but it was a calling to reach the people in all the places we lived, which we moved 14 times.
Mm.
So I think God had a lot of people for me to reach, but he began to
Yes.
just transform my perspective to, instead of all the pity party,
Right.
and the feeling sorry for myself, is to see needs and be able to fill those. When we would show up at a new base, for example, some assignments you show up to, you kind of get a welcome and people extend themselves to you, and then other times they don't.
Right.
And so instead of complaining about it, I just began to do that when I saw a void, and really just see lonely people and reach out to them, invite them into community. And then I mentioned that we went to this marriage conference, and at the end of this marriage conference, they pitched from the platform that if you had learned some good principles that you wanted to share with others, that they had a small group guide that you could buy for $8, and you could share this with people in your community. And so my husband and I were blown away by what we had learned,
Right.
about more of a sacrificial marriage and love and respect in your marriage. And so we said, okay, marriage is hard, but military marriage might be harder. And so we
Mhm.
took these guides and we began leading small groups with other military couples. And we did that in 12 of our 14 duty stations. So we would show up,
Wow.
boots on the ground, not even completely unpack our boxes, meet another couple and say, hey, do you want to come to our house for small group study? And we usually got people to commit to 4 weeks. That's all they had to do. 4 weeks. Do you want to come work on your marriage? And surprisingly, I do not remember a time when we extended an invitation to someone when they did not want to come. We would
Wow.
offer childcare. Um, I don't make it fancy to come to my house. You might get a cup of lemonade. That's country time and a cup of coffee. But what is welcoming is my heart. And we were
Mm,
just inviting people into our home to say, hey, it is hard, but don't give up on your marriage. You know, you
right.
can work on it and you can bring God into a part of your marriage.
Beautiful.
Um, so we continued to do that. And I think that's a ripple that God began. And so God transformed me from I hate the military to these are my people. I believe the
Yes.
military is a people group because we have our own language,
Oh,
we have our
indeed.
own uniform. We are odd, but now my husband has retired, but we're still serving the military. That's who we're passionate about bringing life to, and the message of Jesus Christ, and just that abundant life that we have in following Him.
Oh, that is beautiful. And so you have taken this and have compiled it into a book that was just released on the 22nd of October called Another Move God. Please tell me all about this book that you've just released.
Sure. So the book, I'm very passionate about the Bible because of what it did for my life. And
Mhm.
I mentioned that that first Bible study I did, it was on the life of Sarah and Abraham. And this is the first time I'd ever opened the Bible for myself and read it. And right away, God started in Sarah and Abraham's story. And as I began to study them, again, by this point, I'm not a normal person. I'm a military spouse for probably 3 or 4 years. I see my life and I
Mhm.
see, oh my goodness, this God that I don't fully understand, I think he's real because he's reaching out to me. You know, when God told Sarah and Abraham to go to a land that he would call them, right away I said, that's a permanent change of station or a PCS.
Mhm.
No, they were called to leave their family, their home, everything they knew, and go where God was calling them. And then Sarah and Abraham continued to transition and move around. You know, they went to Haran, they went to Canaan, they went to Bethel, they went to the Oaks of the Marm, they went down to Egypt, they came back to Bethel. And they were doing all this moving and transitioning without movers and moving vans. Like it was on livestock. So it kind of
Yeah.
caused me to say, like, oh,
Mm.
maybe I don't have as much to complain about as I thought I did. And then Abraham was a warrior. And most people don't think of Abraham as a warrior. I mean, we tend to think of him as like an old guy with a beard and a flowing head covering. But he went off to rescue his nephew Lot when Lot had been taken prisoner from the four kings in their armies. And Abraham took his 318 trained men and he went off and he fought in brutal combat because I've studied the history of the ancient world at that time. It was absolutely brutal. There's
Mm.
no reason why Abraham should have been victorious, but he
Right.
was. And
Wow.
I believe that's because God went to war for him. And in fact, right after that battle, God appears to Abraham in a vision and he tells him, I am your shield. And I
Oh, wow.
love that because that is
Yeah.
such a military term. And that's something I really clung to as a military spouse, that God was my husband's shield. God was to
Mhm.
be his protection. And my husband might, I mean, he used multi-million-dollar weapons, um, but I had a weapon too. And my weapon was the weapon of prayer, which is what, God tells us to do. But I could pray for God to be my husband's shield. So basically, the book follows the life of Sarah and Abraham and just gives what are the biblical lessons and how can this speak to your life. But I address all of the normal emotions and challenges that I believe the military wife has that I had.
Right.
A loneliness, how to create community, dealing with fear, moving, transitioning, all the struggles of solo parenting. So it just addresses all of those things, but says, what does God's word have to do about it? And obviously, I'm passionate about the topic of marriage, and I do address it a good bit. How do we do this thing called marriage in a military marriage.
Right.
So that's just basically the journey, Genesis 12 through 22. And it's 30 lessons that I believe that Sarah and Abraham's story has to speak to the
Nice.
military wife. And I think one of this is kind of like a love letter that I'm writing to that young military spouse, the things that I wish I had known,
Oh, nice.
earlier than
Yeah.
I did. And
Yeah.
really to embrace the life and think of it as an adventure and an opportunity and to be on mission with your man. Yes, he carries the weapons, you don't, but you can impact lives as you go and trust that God is in control. And I really believe in something I used to say to myself out loud, when we would get that assignment or the deployment or the job that you didn't ask for, because all of those happen.
Hmm.
I used to say out loud, speaking to myself just as much to my husband, I would say, well, God outranks the generals. To
Mm.
just realize that it might not be our plan and it might not be what we wanted, but that God is in control and it's what he wants and that he has purpose. And just like he's been faithful for all the other places we went and the assignments we didn't, or the jobs or the promotion that you didn't get, like all the things, God's
Right.
been faithful before and he can be trusted this time. And really, that I feel like is the biggest point that I would tell people for a survival mechanism is to say, God is in control.
Hmm.
And so I think our biggest ripple is with our military ministry, but I also realized early on that I could minister to the military spouses by leading them in Bible study. And I did not have guides that were specifically written for the military spouse.
Right.
We were just engaging over a book of the Bible with a lot of shared experience and challenges. But I do remember saying many times to myself, wow, I really wish somebody had written something
Hmm.
that would specifically address some of our unique concerns.
Oh, for
And
sure.
then when I was getting my master's degree, God began to speak to me not in an audible voice, but through his spirit, that perhaps he was equipping me to write something like that for the military spouse to encourage her and really help her to feel very seen by a
Right.
sovereign God, that he has his eye on her.
Yeah. Yeah. That's beautiful. Oh,
Thank you.
wow. That is so wonderful. I'm so glad that you were called upon to write that book because yeah, you're right. There's nothing out there right now to help guide those who are in the military, um, especially the spouses who like you get dumped lovingly with your husband or wife. You move to a place and it's like everything's going to be okay, and you help each other until the orders hit and they deploy. And then you're
Mm-hmm.
like, what do I do now? And yes, those 30 encouragements to embrace the life as a military spouse is beautiful. And I thank you for writing that.
Well, I consider it a privilege, that I got to do this, that I get to speak into the lives of others that are going through this struggle and perhaps, need a little bit of direction to say, you can make it. I'm cheering you on. I know you can do it with God's
That's
help.
beautiful. That's beautiful. Yeah, because there's so many things that happen in the military family and in moving that people don't realize that it's like, for instance, I know from experience is every time I deployed, especially the first time, the people I love, my spouse, my children, the week before I deployed, were arguing.
Of
We
course.
are we are arguing, and it was like, I mean, when I'm leaving, I it's heartbreaking because we're leaving on such bad notes, and
Hmm.
I did not know that that was perfectly normal. It is a
Hmm.
self-defense mechanism that subconsciously you are trying to break ties so you can go on this deployment.
Hmm.
I didn't know that was normal, and it
Hmm.
was ruining my family.
Yes.
So until somebody told me, "Hey, that's normal," I didn't realize it. So to have a book out there to give a little insight to those who are just starting the journey or lost in the journey and need a way, that's beautiful.
Yeah. Or even just somebody who's just PCSed and, they're in that lonely phase right now, just to
Mhm.
pick it up, to get some encouragement to remind yourself that God's been faithful in the past and he's going to be faithful this time. And it doesn't really matter how long you've been in. You can
No.
still get moves or assignments that they just don't seem so good at first. Towards the end of
Right.
my husband's career, we had a couple assignments that were a struggle at first. I think the hardest one for me was when we were um, not really associated with a military installation, because then I didn't have my people.
Right.
There was just civilians, which I love civilians, don't get me wrong, but they don't, their lives are different. They have stability. And sometimes they don't have space in their friend circles because they don't transition. And, when you're a military family, your community is constantly changing because either you are moving or they are. And I feel
Right.
like a military spouse always has space to bring on another friend, and sometimes civilians don't. So even though we did it for 25 years, in some ways it got easier, but in some ways you still have new challenges.
Right. Right. So, is there one piece of advice that you would hang your hat on that you want to share with the listener right now, um, for them to really to resonate with them?
I think just the reason the tagline of the book is for embracing the life, right? Stop. I just think you have to, like, once you stop fighting it and you recognize that a God is sovereign, that means he's control. And sovereignty is something that I don't completely understand, but I completely trust.
Hmm.
Is that, even though I get to make choices, God is still in control. He is still laying the track work for the train of our lives. And so I think, yeah, just to say, okay, if you are married to someone serving in uniform, then you have an opportunity. You have an opportunity to be supportive, but really to impact lives yourself and be impacted by others. I mean, I think back about who I was before this great adventure. I think I'm such a better person. The character that it's shaped in me, the way that it's
Hmm.
made me be less selfish, the
Hmm.
different skills, that God has given me as a result of all the transition and all the people we've met. And, it embrace it, because it only is a season. And that's easy for me to say now, right? Because we're on the other side of the season. But,
Right.
for example, my husband moved really frequently. And I did choose to stay home with our children for a while. And I'm glad I did, because they had so much transition in their life, and we really felt I was called to be the stability. Um, but that was just a season. Like, now I've gotten my master's degree, I've written a book, I'm doing
Yes.
these really exciting things, and um, I'm not able to do as much around the home now because I also work full time in ministry, and writing a book is a pretty full time job as well. And
Yes.
so my husband, who served 25 years in the military, is cleaning our house now.
Yes.
So roles have kind of switched for us.
Hmm.
And so it is a season, and
Yeah.
embrace it. And instead of fighting it, just say, okay, God wants to do something in me as well.
Hmm.
And I have a calling on my life. And really just um, to get behind your husband or spouse, your husband or wife, whoever that
Right.
is,
Right.
and support them, because likely if you're married, they have a commitment, whether it
Yes.
be 4 years, 5 years, 10 years, whatever. Um, make the best of it and be all in during that time, but recognize it's a season.
Yes.
And we get to reprioritize different things, but it's not forever. And I know um, when you are facing difficult things, what we focus on grows. So if we're in a difficult situation and we don't like it, the more we focus on, the bigger it becomes. And I get it. I've been there. I'm not all judging you. Um, but it won't last forever. And,
No.
scripture tells us that darkness lasts for a night, but joy comes in the morning. There is a next chapter, and it is good.
Hmm.
There is a tomorrow, and it is
Yes.
good.
Yes.
But we have to have hope, and we
Indeed.
have to keep fighting. And I really believe we have to fight for our marriages. I see so many military marriages quit even after the 20 years of retirement, because then they kind of have not dealt with all their stuff. They've just shoved it
Right.
under the rug for a while. And then
Right.
when they're no longer serving, deploying, going on missions, they kind of have time to deal with it and say, oh, wow, we've really grown apart. And I feel like marriage, if you stay committed, especially a Christian marriage, I think marriage is like the stock market. There are ups and downs, but it is always on the rise.
Right.
And if we jump ship, we are missing out on that big gain we could have had.
Oh, for
Um,
sure. For
so I
sure.
just want to encourage people to fight, because marriage is worth fighting for, and it is worth making it through the difficult times. But try to focus on hope.
Oh, indeed, indeed, and to be a one of those that a statistic that didn't make it, we made it 23 years before we were
Oh,
divorced,
wow. I'm sorry
and
to
I
hear
served
that.
27, and the military has it definitely put a strain on it.
Oh,
All the
absolutely.
deployments, all the moves, all of that, and and like you said, as a spouse, be it your wife or a husband, when the active duty person is they're serving, they're obligated, they have a mission and a calling. And if you are on the other side going, I hate this, and you're full of the negative,
Hmm.
it makes it really, really difficult for that active duty person to be able to put on their uniform and do what
Hmm.
they do.
Yeah, absolutely. It does. Yeah. And I wrote a blog post about this about a month ago. It's just basically 10 ways I gave up my bitterness and resentment. I did have it. But
Oh,
I
for
think
sure.
what I realized was that the person I was harming the most with the bitterness and resentment was me.
Yeah.
And it really was a surrender. But there are so many things that we can do to not put all that pressure on this other person to be meeting all of our needs.
Yes. Yes.
So I would encourage people to check that out. I think that we can struggle with that in any marriage,
Absolutely.
but I think it's especially a concern because the military does ask a lot. They ask a whole lot,
Oh,
and
yeah.
duty calls a lot.
Hmm.
And I think it's hard. I mean, there were tears, there was anger. I'm not gonna lie, um, but my husband prioritized me when he could, and one of the things that I felt like he did really well is he would constantly tell me this. He would say, hey, I have to go, do whatever. I got to work this weekend. I got to work late. I got to go TDY, got to deploy, whatever. But he would say, I wish I could be with you. Like, I
Hmm.
wish I could. I can't.
Hmm. Hmm.
And that went a long way to silence the lies that the enemy would tell me because it's so easy to go there, right? You could say, oh, maybe he's having an affair, or oh,
Right.
maybe he doesn't love me, or maybe he's choosing work over me, right? But
Right. Right.
you have to understand that it is duty. Duty does call, but you do also have to expect your spouse wearing the uniform to choose the spouse at home when they can.
Yes.
Um, right.
Yes.
So it's
Oh, for
there's
sure.
there's always fault on both parts.
Hmm.
Um, but I'm always just speaking to the spouse because I didn't wear the uniform. But the wall of bitterness can be very, very damaging to your
Oh, for
marriage.
sure. For sure. For sure.
And the only person that can take those bricks down is the person who has built the wall of bitterness.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. And I have a tagline that goes along with Ripple Retreat that I say at the end of every episode of podcast, and it's very applicable in this situation because we react and we always it's hard to control that and reaction. And what I like to do is just pause. So my tagline is pause, love yourself, and be aware of your ripple. Because in this situation, as a spouse, and you just found out from your active duty spouse that they're deploying again, your reaction sets the tone. So at that point, you get hit, pause, love yourself because that's you need to not beat yourself up. You need not to beat anybody else up. Just take care of yourself. And then be aware that whatever ripple you are going to send out, it will change that other person. So if you can be supportive and beautiful and loving to that spouse, it'll help for sure.
Yeah, and we're not just impacting our spouse. That's obviously the biggest impact of the ripple, right?
Yeah.
But kids,
Kids.
neighbors,
Yep.
people you serve with,
Yep.
that's what I began to realize is that I had additional motivation to fight for our marriage because I saw all these young airmen that were
Hmm.
watching us and were saying, what does a Christian marriage look like? And, I had younger military spouses looking for me for guidance on how do I do this life that is not easy.
No.
So I think the ripples, it's like in the ocean, it can keep going
Oh, for
and
sure.
lots of people can be impacted for good,
Yes.
or negatively. Yeah. And I just think we have to, by the power of the Lord, be an impact for good.
Yeah. Yeah. That's beautiful. Well said. Well said. Well, thank you so much, Beth, for sharing your time and your story. Um, do you have any words of advice for those that are starting the journey?
I would just say, find a mentor. I think that's really critical, to find a mentor. And I think we can have different kinds of mentors.
Mhm.
We can have career mentors, we can have parenting mentors, we can have marriage mentors. So ask someone else, and, to mentor you, and look for somebody who's a couple years or even more down the road for you, and just get them to mentor you. But don't give up, and see yourself as called to.
Great advice. And of course, buy your book.
Thank you.
All right. Another move, God, with a question mark. Now,
Yes.
where can they buy your book at?
So it's available on Amazon, Barnes and
Okay.
Noble, Walmart.com, Lifeway, all the places. And you can also go to my website. I do blog content for military spouses. I have lots of articles out there. And then I also I have base insider guides for about 15 bases around, or installations, sorry, post and bases.
Nice.
Just insider information. I have a lot of information on um, tips and tricks to travel cheap with all the military benefits and
Yeah.
all of the MWR resorts that you can be a part of. So just trying to help people. Again, just stuff that I wish I would have known earlier.
Yeah. Oh, that's awesome. And what's your website?
It's BethRunkle.com, and my last name is spelled Runkle.
Perfect. Excellent. Well, wonderful. All right. Well, thank you, Beth, so much for sharing. We got your website, your book, and I hope that everybody out there buys a copy. And if you know of somebody that's active duty, please share this podcast with them, and at least the link to the book.
Great. Thank you so much. I appreciate you having me on.
Thank you for
Again,
your
thanks for
time.
your service.
Oh, thank you, ma'am, and thank you for yours. And as always, please, everybody out there, listener, pause, love yourself, and be aware of your ripple. With love and gratitude from me, JJ. Thank you, Beth.
Thank you.